joining this presentation and discussion this evening. Really appreciate your interest in the topic. Appreciate you taking an hour or so out of your other activities to learn a little bit about climate change and forestry. I'm guessing that everyone on this call has seen many presentations and many articles on climate change so far. We're not going to go very deeply into the science of climate change and the atmospheric part of it tonight, partly because I think most of you know that already, and partly because that can get kind of depressing after a while, and we don't need any more of that these days. So we will try to focus on the connections between climate and forests, and to take that one step further to forest management. I expect all of you may have a little different motivation for being interested in this information, and we will certainly have time for you to ask questions, whether it's about the lands that you live in, or the lands surrounding you, or public lands, or maybe just the trees in the neighborhood where you live. So I think all those perspectives are important and valuable, and we'll try to capture those. This is a topic that I've been doing research on for about 30 years now. And so I think there's a tendency for some of us to think, well, this is a recent topic. In fact, there are 30 years of climate change science in the books, in the scientific literature. And so we have an enormous amount of information. We can always use some more information to improve our certainty, but we certainly have enough at this point in time to move forward with decision-making about forest planning and management. So let's start this off with just a little tickler. And those of you who have seen trees that look like that in the past few years, could you just put a little note in the chat box so we can see how universal this might be in our listening audience? They're adding up quickly. Excellent. Thank you so much for responding. I think whether you live on the east side of the Cascades or the west side of the Cascades, this is something that has increased in prominence since about 2015. People have seen dead western red cedar, dead western hemlock, other trees, whether they're in our national forests, national parks, other public lands, private lands. I know I've heard about this from a lot of small forest landowners who are kind of discouraged to see this going on. So it's a new thing, and it has got people's attention. It's got the general public's attention. So this is a little bit of a signal to us to pay attention to nature. What is this, and why are we seeing it at this point in time? So we'll try to assess that a bit this evening. The interesting thing is that the concept of climate change has already been institutionalized to a certain extent in terms of plant growth. Those of you who are gardeners are almost certainly familiar with the plant hardiness zones that have been developed by the Department of Agriculture. Most of us on this call live in 7, 8, 9, 10, one of those numbers, in terms of the kinds of plants we should be using that will survive and thrive in our Northwest environment. What we see in this particular slide, in the upper slide, the map from 1990 is the old map for plant hardiness zones. The red circle shows you how much those colors have changed when we go to the 2012 map, which is almost 10 years ago now, and the USDA changed it in recognition that the old plant zones were no longer accurate. So this is a really interesting acknowledgement of the effects of climate change on plant growth in general. And although this map is intended primarily for vegetable gardening and horticulture and so forth, I think it's a good one to keep in mind as we talk about forests and trees as well. I want to also emphasize, in looking at this hardiness zone map of Washington, that these zones are based primarily on the average annual extreme minimum temperature. And the minimum temperatures have been going up faster than the maximum or the average temperatures. So what this means in a simplistic way is fewer frosts, fewer really cold nights. It certainly opens the door for using different kinds of plants on the landscape. And it tells us a little bit of something about what we might expect for the future environment in this area. Just to provide a little bit of a framework for what we're going to be talking about, I hear people often talk about natural forests. They say, I want to take a walk in a natural forest, or I want to manage a natural forest. And I think the horse is already out of the barn on that one, because there aren't many natural forests left. Over 90% of our forests, especially at low elevation, have already been cut at least once, sometimes twice. And those forest landscapes have been broken up considerably by timber harvest, agriculture, urbanization, roads, and that breaks up the connectivity of our landscapes. So this notion of historically we had these large swaths of continuous forest is not as often the case anymore. In addition, I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with a lot of the non-native plant species, insects and pathogens that we're dealing with right now. And so those have changed the context within which current forests are battling to survive and thrive in this new world. And then finally, this drought that we just mentioned, this recent drought, 2015 to 2018, obviously that was enough of a drought to have some significant impacts on some of our forest trees. Droughts like that have actually been very uncommon since the 1930s. Now, if you remember back into your history, 1930s was the drought bowl era. And there were some huge impacts of about a 10-year drought across the Great Plains and other areas that changed the economy and social fabric of the United States, in addition to the ecology of some of those landscapes. So if we go back into the deeper history, we see that prior to 1900, back into the 1600s, that droughts were much more common throughout Western North America. More common, longer, and of greater magnitude than they have been in the last 80 years or so. So we've been, in a way, kind of dodging the bullet in recent decades because we haven't had these kinds of droughts. Now in the future, if we would perhaps return to sort of a quote, normal, unquote, periodicity of droughts, in addition to climate change, that could really be a game changer. All right. So a lot of us have been interested in understanding what the future might look like in terms of the distribution and abundance of our forest species. There are three different sources of scientific information that we can use to look at that. One is the deep history of plants. This is over thousands of years, called Paleoecological data. The second one is modeling of plant responses to climate using complex algorithms and computer models. And the third one is simply ranking susceptibility to climate change effects based on the life history characteristics of plants, about which we know quite a bit. So let's go through this briefly, and you can see the range of information that we have. First of all, the paleoecological evidence is based primarily on the extraction of sediment cores from the bases of lakes or ponds. You can see the little cartoon there that shows how those cores are taken and pulled up out of the lake. Those cores are then prepared in the lab, and you can see by this photo the year-by-year accretion of sediment. And those are annually resolved rings, if you will, in the sediment. And each of those rings then has a particular amount of pollen located in it. And then some poor soul has to sit in the lab for probably hundreds of hours analyzing the percentages of the different species of pollens that exist in that core from the top to the bottom. So that's where we come up with the information that I'm going to show you in the following figures. This is what's called a pollen diagram. Do not be fazed by the size and detail of it. We'll walk through it in just a minute. On the far left, you see the years of the sediment core from current 0 down the figure to 19,000 years ago. This is the sediment core itself, the second column. And then we have species arrayed across the top. The size of the little graphs that you see there represent the relative abundance of each species through time from 19,000 years ago to the present. This particular core was taken from a mineral lake, Washington, which is near Mount Rainier. So this is a west side Cascade system. Let's look at pine first of all. And if you look down there under where it says pinus, we see that pine was really quite common during the cooler glacial and post-glacial period. After that, very little at this location. Fir, I think we missed one there. Spruce, very similar, used to be common in a cooler environment. Nowadays, not nearly as much. Fir, exactly the opposite. It became more common after the glaciers retreated and the climate began to warm up the last 10,000 years. Douglas fir, same thing. And Douglas fir, you know, we think of that as our species, especially on the west side, that's always been around, but it's a relatively recent complement of current forests, at least in geologic time, that was permitted by the warmer post-glacial climate. Western hemlock, same thing. Western red cedar, essentially the same thing. So we have Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, kind of as a trio of species that have emerged in this warmer post-glacial period. And then finally alder, which has actually been quite successful regardless of whether we had a warmer or cooler climate. And that might not be surprising because it's so keyed to a disturbed environment, whether that's fire, landslides, or whatever. Once you remove the existing trees from the landscape, alder can come in there. So just a little bit of a look at the last 19,000 years or so. This is a representation of some output from a vegetation model for Southwest Washington. And we can see the trend lines pretty clearly here, starting in the upper left. We have the area. The higher the curve, the more the area. Over time, these are projected into the future from roughly the current time up to the year 2100. We see that it is predicted that subalpine parkland will become much less common. Mountain hemlock won't change too much. Pacific silver fir will decline a bit. Western hemlock is expected to decline a bit. Douglas fir is the big winner. We're just talking about how that has done better in a warmer post-glacial climate. Well, that is something that we expect will continue into the future, out to the end of the century, and essentially the same thing for grand fir, which in this landscape goes from a very low level to a much higher level. These, you see the width of each of these curves, especially like for grand fir, that represents a large confidence interval around that mean dark line. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with these kinds of projections. The last one that I mentioned was species ranking. So this is some results from a study that took various species characteristics and made expert judgments on what that meant for climate change susceptibility. So we have a whole list of species down the left column. We have some characteristics across the top here, and then we have a final score out there at the end, which was calculated in kind of a mysterious way, in all honesty. And so at the top here, they're suggesting that some of our subalpine species are expected to be quite sensitive in the future, the firs, spruce, and so forth, mountain hemlock. And then we get down to the bottom, and we have some species that are expected to be less sensitive, including red alder. There are some concurrences between this piece of evidence and the previous evidence I showed you, and there are some major disagreements between this evidence and the data I showed you. So there is not a consensus within the scientific community as to what we will expect in the future. Part of that reflects our lack of knowledge of how species will compete with each other across an altered landscape. And part of it is reflected in the fact that we will probably have more disturbances in the future, which will perhaps override the other aspects of climate change. So just a little bit of a context for you to think about.
Hey, Dave, can you take a couple questions?
You bet.
Okay, I see a couple questions have come in. Back to the 90% of forests having been harvested, is that for all of the US or just Washington State?
Well, it's both, really.
Okay, great. And a question about the vegetation modeling. What about Thuya plicata?
Yes, that is predicted. We didn't show all the results of this particular modeling effort, but Western red cedar was predicted to decline somewhat. And remember, this is just one landscape, Southwest Washington, so this is not intended to represent the rest of Western Washington or Eastern Washington, just this one area.
Okay, and I'll do one more here. It says your graphs appear to focus on temperature change. I'm curious what inputs were used regarding anticipated future moisture regime associated with the increased temperature. That's a great question, and that's an issue with the seed lot selection tool as well. So Dave, can you cover that?
Did that refer to a specific slide? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure. I think just talking about either your charts, I think the graphs that we were just looking at is my guess.
This one here. Okay. Yeah, the projections here were based primarily on temperature change. And it's an excellent question because the climate change models also project that, most of the models project that we will have an increase in precipitation over the next several decades. That increase in precipitation is projected for the winter only, and summers are actually projected to become drier. So I feel that that particular factor of the dryness increasing in the summer combined with high temperature will very quickly override whatever benefit we might get from a small amount of precipitation increase. And those projections for precipitation are of much greater uncertainty than the projections for temperature.
All right, thanks y'all for your questions. And again, you can keep putting questions in the chat box. We will only pause periodically, maybe one more time during the program to take a few questions, and then we can answer all the remaining questions at the end.
So one thing we know a lot about is kind of characteristics that we would expect climate tolerant species to have. Typically, these will be species that have a high rate of reproduction. They produce lots of seeds. They disperse those seeds well. They propagate in other ways vegetatively. They're tolerant of low soil moisture. That's kind of a no-brainer. They're tolerant of high air temperature. They are tolerant of different types of disturbances, particularly wildfire. And they compete well across the landscape. Remember now, this is going to be a battle of survival in the future. And often they are benefited by having broad environmental tolerance, which means that they could handle both very hot and very cold temperatures, and high genetic diversity, which is a topic we're going to talk more about later on in this presentation. So one of the questions I get most frequently is, how do we expect trees to grow in a warmer climate? And I'll give you just some very general inferences about this. Let's take a look first at our kind of typical low elevation west side forest. Species like Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, Sitka spruce. You know, we have this sort of stereotype of things being very wet on the west side, but summers are always dry. No matter how much rain we get in the winter, it's all about how much moisture is in the soil in the summer. And for the most part, all of these species are moisture limited on the west side. We don't think about that very much, but go out in the woods sometime in July or August and dig a hole in the soil, and you'll see just how dry it does get in the summer. So we expect all these species to have reduced growth. I've done a study of Douglas fir throughout the western U.S., and this is a consistent pattern that we expect to occur pretty much throughout the range of Douglas fir, lower growth. Look at our kind of typical east side forest, dry forest with ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch, probably some grand fir in there as well. Now these forests are already in a drier climate, so they are clearly moisture limited. And again, scientific data that we've collected over decades indicates that they will almost certainly have decreased growth in the future. Now, we're not saying they're going to drop over dead, but that they will be perhaps growing slower and be a little less vigorous. Now let's take a look at our high elevation forest, our subalpine ecosystems. These forests operate a little bit differently, and their limiting factor is typically energy. And when I say energy, I mean the length of the growing season, how much sun and heat they're getting. If you are under snow for 8-9 months of the year, that gives you a pretty short growing season. So if you remove some of that snow and have a longer growing season, then we expect the growth of some of these species like subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, and lodgepole pine may actually increase in the future. So this points out the fact that there are certainly winners and losers depending on where you are, which forest species you're talking about. And I also want to mention something about our areas, our systems that are dominated by the influence of soil water, riparian areas, wetlands. I'm sure a lot of you folks who are forest landowners have some of these on your land. These are totally water controlled. So if we reduce the amount of water that's present in the summer, it could really change the species combinations and abundances out there. It could reduce growth, reduce regeneration. And look at that very last point down there. It says fire susceptibility. I think this is something particularly to pay attention to on the east side of the Cascades, where in the historical past, even our riparian areas have been fairly safe from some of these big fires, but that may no longer be the case if we push them into a drier situation on an annual basis. All right, well, we'd like to do something about all this. And the term that's usually used is climate change adaptation. How do we adapt systems and organizations going on into the future? And I like to show this little cartoon here because I think this is how some of our resource managers feel. It's how some of our forest landowners feel, that you've got a whole bunch of different decisions to make, and they might be difficult decisions, but you got to make a decision. You got to go through one of those doors and move forward. So what we'd like to do with adaptation is to reduce the negative outcomes of climate change. And when I say negative, I mean that in human terms. We define what is negative. I mentioned that some trees could increase in growth. Some trees will decrease in growth. Some trees may die back. Some trees may flourish. A more realistic approach, rather than resisting the effects of climate change or somehow creating this barrier, is to transition systems and species into this warmer climate, because it's coming down the road, and I think this is a more realistic approach to having forests and having sustainable forests in the future. For the most part, you know, a lot of our public land managers are already doing a really good job at planning and management and doing sustainable forest management. They use practices that are already climate smart. And so we're not going to be doing a wholesale change in how we go about forest management. It may be mostly a fine-tuning and prioritization process to add to our current practices. This is all falling under the banner of sustainable resource management. Yes, forests might look different in the future, but we can still hopefully manage them sustainably over the long term. Also, as we think about forest management, I like to invoke risk management a lot. Our public land managers use risk management all the time. First of all, they assess the risk of various things happening, whether it's fire, insect attacks, pathogen outbreaks, flooding, whatever that may be, and then they select various options for addressing those risks over time. Small forest landowners can do the same exact thing. So let's go through some of the options that we may have for creating resilient forests in a warmer climate. Many of you have probably heard the term restoration or ecological restoration. That has been essentially the focus of a lot of public land management for the last 30 years, is trying to change what we essentially caused over the previous decades in terms of timber harvest and various fire management practices or lack thereof. So we have generally looked at what's called the natural or historic range of variation. So using the past as a guide for identifying targets for success. So you might say, well, I want this forest to look like it did in 1850. And that's a legitimate thing to do, but it may not be as successful as it used to be. And for better or worse, usually because of budgets and practical reasons, most of our restoration has been done at fairly small scales. So I'd like to suggest that we change the terminology a bit to resilience building and talk about creating resilient forests and resilient systems. So we can now, in addition to all the other information and things you think about, incorporate climate change data, climate change concepts into planning and management. And then think about using the concept of future range of variation. What do we expect it to be in the year 2080 as opposed to what it was in 1850? And then do this at largest spatial scales as we can, because that's the only way we'll really make an impact in the long term. Okay, now I'm going to go through a number of concepts and recommendations for good practices here, and I'm going to start with the concept of forest regeneration. So this is where the big competition happens. The trees that survive the first few years of life will typically be the trees that end up being the mature occupants of any particular location. So after you have a fire, after you have a clear cut, after you have a big wind throw, the tree establishment determines who the winners and losers are in warmer climate, and they'll be competing in a different environment than they may have competed in 100 years ago. Seedlings in general have to deal with this high variation in temperature and moisture at the soil surface, so it's a tough world out there for these small trees, and it may be even tougher for some species in the future. We really need to take care of our seedlings and saplings. Taking care of our young trees is the first best thing we can do to get stands established that will survive in the long term. And retaining soil moisture, whether it's on the east side or the west side, is really the key to that initial growth. We see here a photo of a little Douglas fir seedling that has been mulched with some organic matter and wood chips. And I'm guessing some of you are thinking, well, I'm not going to do that over my property. I can't do that over 20 acres. And you don't have to. You can do it around your home maybe, or places you can reach easily. What you can do is kick up a little of the duff and the wood chips that might be on the soil surface and yard those up around the tree to just give it a chance through that first year or two of growth. And we also need to do all of our usual things to protect trees. What we want to do here is to reduce all the sources of stress that we can. Sometimes the biggest source of stress are deer or elk or mountain beavers. And so, we can do everything we can about climate change, but if we forget the basics, we might miss an important feature of regeneration. Drought-tolerant species are something we really need to think about for the future. We know a good deal about which species we expect to be drought-tolerant. We already mentioned Douglas fir. At least on the west side, it's the most drought-tolerant species, and so although we already have a heck of a lot of Douglas fir in the landscape, we may be planting more of it in the future. We may be preferring it on some sites, whereas in the past we might have gone for other species. Grand fir is present on both the west side and east side and is quite drought tolerant as well. We haven't used that as much on the west side as we have in other species like western red cedar. So again, we're thinking of, let's maybe try some different things. On the east side of the Cascades, ponderosa pine will continue to be our go-to species, and Douglas fir in the correct locations. So there's some changes here, but I think it's mostly fine-tuning. Here's a list of species that seem to do a good job with low soil moisture and or well-drained soil, which really are two different phenomena. So just, you know, it's good to know the ecology of each of these species, the life history of each of these species. And so when we're planning for a stand that may mature 50, 60, 70 years from now, we should be thoughtful about which species will tolerate the conditions of later in the 21st century. I'm not saying you should go out there and start planting white oak and madrone all over the place. I'm just listing a few things here to think about. Also, for most small forest landowners, you have some hardwoods on your lands. You might think of them as a little bit of a pain because they can be more challenging to manage. But hardwoods add diversity, especially in your riparian areas, and diversity is good. And hardwoods are great for wildlife habitat, certain types of wood products, firewood. They're more resistant to the very nasty conifer diseases that seem to bother a lot of us. And then, of course, red alder provides you some free nitrogen in the soil because it pulls it out of the air. So, you know, keep hardwoods in the mix, if you will. That doesn't mean you have to plant them in every stand, but if you have hardwoods or want to dedicate a portion of your land to hardwoods, I think that's a good call. Also, let's not forget about our understory species. We've got some great ones that are drought tolerant, that are colorful, that produce fruits for wildlife species. And some of these are on the west side, some on the east side. I love mock orange and chokecherry, even though they are typically east side species and do remarkably well there. I think they're also good options on the west side, especially as the climate continues to get drier. You know, a few decades ago, we taught the concept of planting monocultures and single structure type stands because that was the state of science at the time, but that is no longer the case. Diversification of the species and of the structure of forest stands is one of the best things that you can do to create different environments and habitats within a forest landscape. So if you get a particular type of insect that attacks only species X, and you've planted only species X, you don't lose the whole stand. You still have some trees remaining that will survive. And if you have a specific pathogen that attacks only very old trees, if you have some younger trees of smaller stature, those may survive that. So this is called hedging your bets, or you know, basically diversifying your portfolio so you have multiple systems out there to create resilience. You can do this typically by partitioning species across the landscape according to their water needs. And you can block them up as shown in this diagram here, but be very thoughtful about this as you put trees out on your land. One thing I want to just mention here is this concept of seed zones. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the fact that these kinds of maps exist for each of our tree species that suggests where you should get your nursery stock from. And that has always been, well, it should be from where you live. So if you live out in the Pend Oreille region in Northeast Washington, then you should try to get nursery stock that has been propagated from that area. If you live down in the lower Columbia area, you should try to get nursery stock from that area. We're starting to rethink this due to this increasing temperature. And now we're saying that it might be reasonable to try to diversify the genotypes or genetic characteristics of your plantings. So you may use some trees from your seed zone, some trees from a seed zone to the south, some trees from a seed zone at lower elevation that may have greater heat tolerance. We don't have a formula for you to use on this because it's relatively new and hasn't been applied very broadly yet. But I think you're going to see more of it, and I'd love it if folks could at least consider this when you're doing tree planting. So there's a great website that has this thing called the seed lot selection tool that can assist you with choosing genotypes, provenances of tree species that might be suitable for you as you go about the tree planting process. And it will tell you which ones might work best in the future, in addition to the one that in addition to the zone that you currently live in. All new stuff. Another new topic is this concept of assisted migration, also called managed relocation. What this refers to is planting tree species from one region to another. For example, the incense cedar on the left side, moving some incense cedar into western or eastern Washington, or moving white fir, or moving blue spruce, or moving coast redwood or giant sequoia. And of course, people have already done this, and we see a lot of these other species planted mostly in urban landscapes, and a lot of them seem to do quite well. So the question becomes, should we do this at a large scale? And that is an open question. And the science on this is just now being generated. There's a diversity of opinions on what, where, and when we should do things. I guess my thought on this is to use caution in how quickly and at what spatial scale we start to do this. If you feel like you want to do some experimentation and plant a lot of incense cedar on your property in Western Washington, I'd say go for it. But don't do it everywhere. Do it on a limited extent until we know more about how these species will fare in the future and what implications, if any, there might be for insects and disease. Because I think we're all aware that in the past we've moved a lot of things around the landscape and they've had some bad outcomes in some cases. So again, we're stepping outside this concept of a natural forest. We're talking about mixing it up in terms of the species. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but do it with caution, at least for now. You know, the one thing you can always do with your forest lands is just keep your trees healthy. A healthy tree will tend to resist stressors, including low soil moisture. So reducing the stand density is a critical factor, whether you're on the west side or the east side. There's only so much water to go around, and the best way to increase the water supply is to reduce the density of the trees. Some of you may also want to consider removing surface fuels and understory fuels. This is certainly true on the east side, where this is common practice and has been done for decades because of the potential threat of fire in this forest. But we're even starting to think about this a little bit on the west side, probably not at large spatial scales, but perhaps at least around your home and buildings. And this will be effective if we do it across large areas. If you're living over in Wenatchee or someplace like that and you have 10 acres and you do a great job on removing the fuels in your forest, but none of your neighbors do, that will have limited effectiveness. So it's great when landowners talk to one another and you can kind of share your story and your message about the effectiveness of fuel reduction and density reduction and how that can ensure that they just might escape that next big fire, not only in terms of retaining their forest, but also retaining their home. There's a relatively new practice out there called variable density thinning, which you can use to decrease the density of certain forests. Here's just a sample recipe: 20% open, 20% dense, 60% standard thin. You could vary that a lot. There's no recipe. We have almost no data on the effectiveness of this in the long term. But I think it's reasonable to do this sort of thing again, maybe on a limited basis, and see how it goes. We will certainly be getting more data on the effectiveness of this approach in the next decade or two. And as always, reduce the stressors that you can actually do something about. So if you have a wetland that has a bunch of Japanese knotweed in it, get that stuff out of there if you can. Get the purple loosestrife out. If you have blackberries that you can get out of there, English ivy, or any of a number of the nasty things, cheatgrass, knapweed on the east side, and so forth, do it if it's feasible, if it's practical, because you could save yourself a lot of pain and you'll reduce the stress in those ecosystems at a later point in time. Just a short word about fire. I think this is another one of those topics that a lot of us are probably kind of tired of hearing about, especially as we get into the summer fire season here. And we certainly have had our share of fire in the state of Washington over the past decade, including that big record year where we burned over 1 million acres in 2015. There were some significant impacts on forests and significant impacts on people's livelihoods and communities at that time. There is an increasing dialogue about the need to do our community development and management in different ways that will be beneficial to both the forest and people. This acronym here, WUI, is Wildland Urban Interface. Many people live out and in the woods these days, and typically it's like it is shown on the left cartoon. If you look at the right cartoon, we see a little bit different spatial arrangement where we have multiple points for getting in and out of there. We have open space for a fuel break, and there are more and more communities around the West that are developing various types of codes that require defensible space around property, as well as building codes that require fire-resistant structures. There's also a lot of resistance to doing that sort of thing, which always surprises me, but I think it's common sense that we need to start doing this, especially if we anticipate much greater amounts of fire in the future. So this is about vegetation, but it's also about managing property. This is a little diagram that shows how you could manage your own property if you have a home site where you keep the vegetation very scattered out near the home, and then it can be increasingly dense as you move away from the home. So some general suggestions on this sort of thing are included in the FireWise USA website. So this is kind of the go-to place for understanding how to live with wildfire. And the objective of all this is not to stop wildfire, but to reduce the intensity of fire when it occurs and to reduce the damage it might cause to your values. So if you don't want to copy down this long URL at the bottom, just Google FireWise USA and you'll find tons of information that you can use both in West Side and East Side forests. So let's start to wrap things up here. We anticipate in the future the climate's going to continue to warm. This is not a short-term thing, and especially after 2050, it may even accelerate. That is what the global climate models suggest. So we may have a period of time here where we can get our act together, understand what we're doing, and start implementing new practices. Droughts will be more common. That will be our biggest challenge in sustainable forest management for the next several decades. Those droughts create stress in vegetation, may or may not kill it, but they'll create stress, and most trees can take only so many stressors at one time. This is especially true for reproducing trees and tree seedlings. The other thing about these increasing droughts is that some insects and pathogens take advantage of them. So again, we're compounding the stressors. It rarely is the case that drought alone will kill a tree. It can do that, but more typically, it's multiple stressors that do them in. And then finally, this longer fire season, that's a given. We think we're probably already seeing that being affected by climate change. We'll have more fires, we'll have more area burned by fire, we're going to have more smoke in the air. So we need to get used to that. I think there's going to be some real challenges on the east side in terms of coping as communities and coping socially and economically if, in fact, the projections for increased fire turn out to be true. And there's always surprises. You know, I can show you all the models and all the science in the world, but typically things come up that we weren't thinking about. What can we do about this? Well, first of all, get in the mindset of managing for 30 years from now. Manage for that 2050 that I just mentioned. What will things be like in the 2050s? We have some pretty good projections of what we expect with higher temperatures, higher extremes, and more droughts. So kind of just remove yourself out of today's world and jump forward a few decades. Diversification is your friend. It may not mean diversifying each and every single acre on your property, but diversifying blocks in terms of species, genetic characteristics, and structural patterns across space. When you do have a fire, when you do have an insect attack, or if you do forest harvest, that's an opportunity for doing some different things. That's where you can start maybe planting some different genotypes or planting a different mix of species than you had there before. So embrace that as an opportunity for change and keep track of what you're doing. Use this concept of risk assessment and risk management, whether you're a public land manager, industrial forest landowner, small forest landowner. This will always be a good framework for you to work within. And then whatever you do on your land, monitor it. Keep track of it. Anybody can take photos, or you can keep a notebook with records of what you did and when, and that allows you to learn what has been happening, adjust as needed. And I should have added there, and share that information with other people. Share that with your neighbors. So if you have a success story, tell them about it. If you have a failure, tell them about it. And that way, the concept of resilience management gets spread across the broader landscape. So we will wrap things up right there. I have indicated my email at the bottom of this slide. You're more than welcome to contact me based on questions you might have this evening or something that may come up in the future. Do feel free to contact me and we can have a discussion. Over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Let's dive into some questions. It looks like we got a lot of good ones here. I'll try and go up to the top here. Are there principles guiding assisted migration? I've always heard cautionary tales about introducing non-native species. Oh, and subsequent comment as you answered it. Great, that was an easy one.
Okay, thank you.
But follow-up question for someone else is, are there any invasive species concerns with assisted migration? Is there a limit to the geographical context in which assisted migration could be considered?
We don't know that. We haven't done enough of that with forest species to know. This certainly has been done. Well, first of all, it's been done with plants in general. I mean, plants have been moved all over the world. In any particular garden landscape, the majority of your plants might be from Asia or Europe. Most of them don't cause problems. Occasionally they do, and we may or may not know that ahead of time, or things may have been introduced accidentally. There's a lot of evidence in the world of fisheries about bad things that can happen when you start moving fish around the world. Because I'd talked to a friend of mine who's a fisheries biologist, and I was kind of bemoaning the challenges of moving tree species around. He said, well, heck, Dave, we've been doing this with fish for over 100 years. And my response is, yeah, and look what happened. You've wiped out some of the native species by introducing the non-native. We're generating more and more scientific information on this. And I think it's probably a good rule of thumb to use a limited spatial guideline for moving species around. So let's take a species like incense cedar, which lives in Oregon. So, okay, we might introduce some incense cedar into Washington, and it might be okay. But do we want to start moving species, say, from Colorado to Washington at this point, much longer distance? And I'd say no, not yet. We really, we've made mistakes in the past by not getting sufficient background information first. So I think we really need to let the science mature in this topic. Again, I think we have about 30 years to do that, and then maybe we'll be able to make better decisions. Having said that, I encourage experimentation. I encourage landowners to try things and share your stories.
Okay, another question. At lower west side elevations, are we likely to see longer rotation ages for Douglas fir and western hemlock to allow stands to grow to a merchantable size for timber sales?
What a spectacular question that is. I'm going to ask you for some feedback on this too, Kevin, but I'm going to say that rotation ages may not be affected too much if we keep the densities adjusted correctly to keep trees growing vigorously and resisting other stressors. What do you think, Kevin?
I agree 100%.
So this is one of those cases where we might be doing a little bit of fine tuning. We have all these tables and graphs that guide us in terms of what our ideal stand densities might be, especially for timber production. We might have to modify those a little bit in the future. That will be another area of developing science.
And there's also the factor that we may be growing these trees in different places than we have been.
Very, very true.
Okay, next question. A neighbor near Colville has 120-year-old photos of their ranch showing it was almost totally ponderosa pine. Now it is mostly Doug fir with a lot of western red cedar. Would expect this landscape to move more predominantly to pine again as it gets warmer and drier, but I'm curious about that history. Was that preponderance of pine a result of more frequent wildfires back then? And Dave, before you answer that, I will just say that what a treasure to have those old photos.
That was my thought too. You know, I'd love to personally. I'd love to see those photos from that era. Those are always valuable for us in determining historical context for some of our forests, especially these dry forests. And I think you're right on target in inferring that those pine-dominated open forests were almost certainly maintained by frequent fires that occurred maybe every 5 to 10 to 15 years, reducing the understory, killing the small trees, and maintaining that open landscape. And so the current forest that you're seeing with this understory of different species is probably an anomaly historically because fire has been greatly reduced in some of those landscapes.
Okay. Oh, here's a great question. By thinning and reducing stand density, the understory growth increases. How does water consumption change? Does the high density understory with low density forest stand consume a large volume of water?
Yes, this is the old juggling act, and I think it's actually more important on the east side than on the west side, in my opinion. Generally, the water uptake by those understory species will be considerably less than what it would have been for the tree species that are than the trees that are removed from those locations. So I think it's a fair trade-off. On the east side, you do need to use some care in terms of density reduction so you don't encourage too much regeneration of both trees and understory plants that could in fact affect some of the soil moisture and stress factors in those stands. And it's a real juggling act. I know a lot of silviculturists who basically consider that to be a little bit of art. You know, you can go to the tables and the books that give you guidelines, but I think having some sense of how those different trees and understory species respond to one another in a specific location is very valuable knowledge to have. So yes, be aware of those sorts of things and be aware of the context in which you're doing those types of thinning practices, because you might, you know, generate some other problem you weren't expecting.
Okay, question. Isn't it important to emphasize that the amount of warming we see, especially after 2050, is really up to us?
Well, I can't disagree with that.
Me neither.
It is certainly up to us as the human race, given our current trajectory. Even the challenge here is, even if the Paris Agreement were invoked by all the big carbon emitters in the world, it's still a slower path to destruction because the greenhouse gases would continue to rise at such a rate and to such a concentration that we will continue to have warming decades, if not hundreds of years into the future. But, you know, absolutely, the sooner we can bring down carbon emissions, the sooner we give ourselves a chance to do some things to retain forests where we want them, do sustainable forest management, not have a world that is totally dominated by fires, for example.
I'll add to that that while it is up to us ultimately, it depends on large cooperation among humans, and fortunately, we seem to get even less cooperative with one another every day. So I think one of the things we want to focus on in managing our forests is what can you do as an individual to help your forest in the near term? Okay, what do you think about the potential for cross-laminate timber in Washington? It seems to be one way of recovering volume from small diameter saw logs, which maybe we will see more of in sales if droughts continue.
Not really my expertise. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about that. I think there's a lot of kind of excitement and promise in that because it utilizes even more wood in buildings, long-lived wood products. And not only is that long-term carbon sequestration, but it's also displacing and substituting fossil fuel intensive products like steel and concrete. So if we start using cross-laminate timbers instead of steel and concrete, that could be very beneficial to our net balance of carbon emissions.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like a double gain. You know, first of all, you're displacing steel and concrete, and so each of those uses is carbon emissions is about 9-10 times of what it would be for wood. So you're saving carbon there, and then if you fix it in a long-lived forest product, that's carbon that you're saving as well. So, you know, it's really kind of a win-win situation. It also, from an economic perspective, using some of that smaller smaller dimensional wood for those products allows some economic benefits for landowners and also public land. That's been a challenge with the whole issue of fuel treatments and thinning and forest management in general, is so many of our mills have closed that there's no market, no commercial market for some of that small material. So this helps with that a bit.
Absolutely. And with more of those types of economic opportunities, that makes maintaining forests as forests more competitive against conversion to development and such. Okay, next question. Is soil content different for trees like it is for plants?
I assume by content they're talking about chemical content. And chemical content of soils varies wildly from place to place, even within relatively small areas. So that's certainly something you need to think about as a forest manager. It's something you need to think about ecologically. And just as an example of why that may be important, on the west side of the Cascades, where we do get so much rainfall, there are very little base cations in the soil. That's calcium, magnesium, potassium, because most of that has been leached out of the soil. And so we tend to focus a lot on nitrogen as the thing that makes trees grow, but there may in fact be some other sorts of things like that. And part of it is the content of the soil, part of it is the conditions under which you grow the trees that will allow them to take up those nutrients over time. But that, if that is in fact what the person was asking, boy, you know, you can look that information up on the web soil survey, and for any particular location for each soil series, you can look up sort of a sample chemical content of the soil.
And Marilyn, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to give a follow-up clarification there in the chat box.
Yeah, or email me.
Okay, what is the best way to handle dead or dying red cedars?
think that's yours, Kevin.
Okay. There are a couple ways to look at it. I tend to take a tough love approach long term, and that if the cedars continue to decline and die, that they might not fit the right tree, right site model anymore. That site may just not be suitable. And that's the problem with our recommendation of right tree, right site is it's a constantly moving target. And I think this is largely soil driven. It's glacial outwash soils that are really gravelly, excessively well drained. Those are tough soils in drought situations. And you may have areas where a certain site is kind of at the margin of acceptability for that species. And with climate change, all of a sudden it's on the other side of that margin and it's no longer acceptable. So that's something to think about long term. Is this species of trees really going to work here, or do you need to start replacing those with more drought tolerant species? In the near term, if they are close together, thinning to free up more available water resources is a good approach. You can give supplemental water. It's especially for really big trees, I don't think it's terribly practical. And because of that, I would only recommend trying it for a couple years just to see if you can get them over a hump. But then, if it always is going to need supplemental water, that's a Band-Aid solution on a long-term problem. Get grass away from the trees. Grass robs all the water. Sprinklers are great for watering lawns, horrible for watering trees. And water doesn't penetrate through that thatch very well. And you may have nice wet grass, but dig down 12, 14 inches to the tree root zone and it's totally dry down there. So pull back the grass, even beyond the drip line, and replace that with a good 4 inches of mulch that's going to keep moisture in, allow good moisture infiltration, keep moisture in, and also keep that root zone cool. I'm a big believer in mulch for a lot of things. I like to say mulch covers a multitude of horticultural sins. If you're going to do some supplemental watering, I would do that in combination with mulch. Say, take a soaker hose and loop it around the tree, maybe halfway between the trunk and the drip line, bury that under the mulch, and then you could run that for several hours so that it's a slow soak deep into the tree's rooting zone, and you're not going to get any evaporative loss. It's all capped down by that mulch, so most bang for your buck. So those are a few approaches. But again, if you find that you're just fighting a losing battle with that, it may be time to think long-term about a more drought-tolerant species. Okay, next question. If we embrace migratory planting, do we draw from the southern states like Oregon or California, or do we look east to Idaho and Montana? Where is the preferred location you recommend? What a great question.
Yeah, I'll just use my mantra of we have no guidelines yet, but I would say if you want to do that, to select from the area that seems like the best next match to the location where you live. So for folks who live in far eastern Washington, especially over in the Colville area, Pend Oreille area, you probably want to be thinking about Idaho and Montana. If you live in southern Washington, you may be thinking about species that are more common in Oregon. So just try to be reasonable about the geographic reach that you make for using these alternative species.
I would add to that, don't be arbitrary about the species you pick. Think it through. A lot of people are moving towards just species they like or think are cool. That may not be the best fit. And also when looking at the next best match, look at both temperature and moisture. And that's, I think, an area where some people are getting tripped up is they're just looking at temperature matches. If you just looked at temperature, Puget Sound area is going to be great for redwoods. But if you factor in moisture, maybe not so much, because they like the cool and fog drip. So be sure to cover both of those bases. And I would also suggest that you experiment and not do it wholesale everywhere. Okay, for new forest owners, where's the best source for further information on planting a 30-acre forest? It wasn't properly planted 10 years ago and is covered in black cottonwood now. Dave, I believe I can answer that.
Go for it.
That's where I come in. So that's what we offer through the WSU Extension program. We offer a multi-week course called Forest Stewardship Coach Planning to help you put together, do an assessment of your forest, and then put together a plan for meeting your objectives. And that comes with 8 weeks of classroom lessons and then a site visit to your property by a forester and a whole library of materials. So I would suggest that you look into that. We will be doing 2 online versions of that this fall. And if you go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, you'll get announcements about that. And I'm typing that in right now. I think that's the right web link. Okay, what effect do the mycorrhiza understory have with the increase in temperature? Will this impact our trees and longevity?
Well, you know, we don't know a lot about the expected climate change impacts on mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are those connectors from the fungal world in soil to the roots of the trees that facilitate the transfer of nutrients and moisture. They're critical, they're required for healthy, vigorous tree growth. How that relationship changes in a warmer climate, we're unsure, but it will absolutely be necessary to have a healthy symbiosis between each tree species and the mycorrhizae that facilitate the growth of that tree species. I have seen a few studies here and there about mycorrhizae and temperature effects and so forth, but I don't think we really have a good, clear picture of where that's headed.
Next up, we have to promote more stand diversity west side. Are we likely to see a change in logging systems which allow for selective logging? Seems that may be one way to retain soil moisture. I've been reading about greater use of cut to length and forwarder harvesting in BC where the terrain allows.
I don't really have an opinion on that, Kevin. You might.
One thing I would say is be careful when thinking about selective logging because it means different things to different people. Are we talking about converting an even-aged forest to an uneven-aged management regime using the selection system? Are we talking about doing a thinning either from below or proportional? So we really need to be careful with the terminology that we use so we're all speaking the same language. Technology is great right now in terms of harvesting systems. And it doesn't always take high technology either. If you really want to be nimble in the woods, horse logging still works. It can be pretty high ground pressure though, so you know it's not always the best thing, just depends on the situation. Kind of a long answer that doesn't really answer the question. Sorry, Simon. But those are kind of my off-the-cuff thoughts about that. Okay, next question. CLT and biofuels as well as biochar bumping into oil and steel industries. There's a lot of political pushback, absolutely. It's going to be on the consumers to demand sustainable products and the leaders in timber and wood engineering to let the customers know why CLT is awesome and get them sold on the idea. I can't disagree on that. Dave, can you?
Nope, good.
Okay. The Roosevelt Cedar Grove in Northeast Washington is showing the dying tops similar to Dave's opening photos. Are we seeing water stress there in those old growth trees?
That's yours.
Okay. Yes, I think that's probably right. Drought damage is usually expressed as top down. It's because of the way water transport is done in trees. You have these connected chains of water molecules, collectively the water column, and as trees transpire, that's pulling that water up the tree. But if there's no new slack coming in from the roots because the soil moisture is depleted, then those columns get under tension and they break. And once they break, there's a hydraulic disconnect and water can't move then beyond that break point. So if you look at a tree with a dead top from drought damage, that transition from where it's alive to dead, that's where the water column broke. So that's why you see that top down is a really good indicator of drought stress. Okay, next question. We live on the edge of a seasonal swamp in the San Juans. The Doug firs on the property appear to be dying from too much water in the winter and long droughts in the summer. What likes that wet feet dry cycle? And Cindy, I think you've brought up an important point where we may be getting on average fairly normal rainfall, but it's coming in the extremes. And that doesn't average out in nature. The record wet in the winter and the record dry in the summer doesn't average out, whereas it ends up being a double whammy for the trees. The tree that comes to mind for me is lodgepole or shore pine. How about you, Dave?
Now, that was my first thought as well. And I think the other thing to think about there is, if the thought is to perhaps plant new trees, that the tolerances of a seedling might be completely different than the tolerances of a mature tree that has deep roots and can access that soil moisture in the summer. So again, think pretty heavily about the regeneration stage and what will survive to be a mature tree.
Sorry, folks, I was muted. In our forested neighborhood, many want to top trees to gain views. Is this a good practice? I can take that, Dave.
You bet.
The short answer is no. And first of all, it's just terribly ugly. Second of all, it's very harmful to the trees because now you're introducing a decay column then into the tree. And third, and perhaps most significantly, it never solves the problem. Because those next highest branches are just going to turn up, and now instead of one top, you've got multiple tops to contend with. And those tops have weak attachments there, and it's at the focal point of the initial decay. So if you're topping because of hazard potential, you've just increased the hazard and the danger of that tree. And you probably have all seen when you have street trees, deciduous trees that are topped under power lines, and then they create just dozens and dozens of these suckers that then go up and get completely tangled in the power lines. And you're like, yeah, that solved the problem, didn't it? So we recommend against topping, and that just comes down to the principle of right tree, right site. If that tree's mature height is a conflict with the objectives of the property owners, then it's not the right tree for that site.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to that, Kevin, if I may,
Yes,
is
please.
that if you're dealing with an existing situation, then there are ways that trees can be trimmed and thinned to provide better views. Topping trees is cheap. That's why a lot of people do it. And to do this selective thinning correctly, you need a skilled arborist, and it's going to cost more money, but it might provide a more sustainable view in the long run and not damage the trees. So it's an option depending on the tree species, depending on the location, depending on how much money people want to spend on it.
Absolutely. And things like crown reduction or putting in view windows, those really need to be expertly done. And please, please, please make the distinction between a generic tree service versus a certified arborist. You want the latter. Okay, Carol, thanks for the plug for the forest stewardship class. And we have a comment that climate change may cause a shift in arbuscular mycorrhizae populations with ectomycorrhizae. Let's see. Okay, I'll take one more here. What are the best recommendations for sites that may be moving toward a moisture regime that will not even allow ponderosa pine to become established, assuming we want to maintain some kind of forest? I know of stands like the Pine Ridge country in eastern Wyoming, where there are seemingly healthy mature ponderosa pines, but no apparent regeneration. And when these sites burn, there's no natural tree regeneration. Dave, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, actually that's a great question, because that's a topic of quite a bit of discussion in the scientific community at the moment, and it has great bearing on, what do we do after a fire occurs in those sorts of locations? Do we plant the same species? Do we do something else? I'm aware of situations on the east side of the Cascades in Washington, particularly on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, where there have been fires, or there have been some indications that ponderosa pine are not particularly thriving in certain locations. And that's usually at the lower tree line of where those species are. In some cases, if you look at the soils where those ponderosa pine are at lower tree line, the soils are more characteristic of grassland soils, which suggests that for the last few thousand years, those sites were probably dominated by grasslands, and that perhaps in some locations where fire has been excluded or something else happened, that those trees, those forests, might actually be an anomaly. So I think we will see this change in species distribution and abundance kind of creep up around the edges at these ecotones between forest-dominated areas and shrub and grass-dominated areas on the east side. And I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to fight that. There's a kind of a, just an old premise that, when your forest burns, you need to replant it in the trees as fast as you can. In many cases, that's probably true. In some cases where the stress level is going to be high, where seed sources have largely been eliminated, I think it's better not to fight Mother Nature, or maybe I should say not fight climate change, and go with what that site will give you in terms of sustainable vegetation cover. In some cases, that might mean not having trees.
Okay, well, thank you, Dave. Thank you all of you for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. You've got Dave's email there if you would like to ask further questions, and just want to wish every one of you a very pleasant good evening. Oh, and watch for a link that'll come by email to you with to a recording of this session.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.